Dirt falls in rhythmic, heavy thuds. Two silhouettes stand over a freshly dug trench in the pouring rain, laughing over the muffled groans beneath the soil. A scrawny teenager watches from the rotting hollow of an oak tree, shivering as mud seeps through his torn sneakers. He should turn away. Survival means minding his own business. But the desperate scraping stops. Silence rings louder than the storm. He steps out of the shadows, gripping a rusted piece of scrap metal. The rain did not fall. It spat. It drove down in hard, icy needles that smelled of ozone and the nearby chemical plant. Leo huddled tighter into the hollow of the rotting oak, pulling the collar of his oversized thrift store corduroy jacket over his ears. He was 20, though. Malnutrition made him look a hardened 16. Hunger was a dull ache in his ribs. A familiar roommate he'd long since stopped trying to evict. Tonight the woods at the edge of the industrial park were supposed to be empty. They were Leo's sanctuary. No cops. No rival squatters. Just the wet decay of autumn leaves and the rusted carcasses of abandoned washing machines. Then the headlights cut through the trees. A late-model Lincoln Town car, heavy and black, crunched over the gravel access road and slid to a halt 50 yards from Leo's tree. The engine cut out, but the heavy thrum of the radiator fan lingered in the damp air. Leo stopped breathing. He pressed his spine against the damp, fibrous wood of the oak. He knew better than to move. When a car like that rolled into a place like this at 2 a.m, you didn't ask for spare change. You vanished. 2 men stepped out. The driver was built like a cinder block, wearing a cheap trench coat that barely covered his wide shoulders. The passenger was leaner, older, smoking a cigarette that hissed softly in the rain. Briggs and Tommy. Leo didn't know their names, but he knew their type. Hard men. Men who did math with broken fingers. The trunk popped with a hollow metallic click. "Grab the legs," the smoking man muttered. His voice carried over the rain, raspy and bored. The heavy man grunted. There was a wet dragging sound, the squeak of expensive leather against rubber weather stripping. They hauled a shape out of the trunk. It was a man. His arms were bound behind him with heavy zip ties. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Leo's life was worth. The fabric caught the dim wash of the tail lights soaked black with rain, and something darker. They dropped him. The body hit the saturated earth with a sickening heavy thwack. Leo's jaw clenched. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to sink further into the bark. "Don't look. Don't look. Just wait for them to leave." But his eyes snapped open when the body on the ground groaned. It wasn't a dead body. "Jesus, he's still making noise," the heavy man complained, shaking off his hands. "I told you we should have hit him again. Boss said no bullets. Boss said put him in the ground, breathing." The older man replied, tossing his cigarette into a puddle. He walked to the open trunk and pulled out 2 spades. He tossed one to his partner. "Start digging. Clay's heavy tonight." They dragged the suited man by his collar to a pre-dug depression near an old drainage ditch. The man on the ground writhed weakly. His face was a mess of swelling and split skin, but there was a terrifying feral clarity in his eyes. He didn't beg. He just twisted his boots, kicking uselessly against the slick mud. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Gabriel," the heavy man panted, kicking the suited man in the ribs. A sharp crack echoed through the trees. Gabriel only let out a low, ragged hiss through his teeth. "Going down quiet, good." They shoved him into the trench. It was about 4 feet deep, a rush job. The water table was so high that an inch of brown water already pooled at the bottom. Gabriel hit the water back first. He thrashed, trying to roll onto his stomach to keep his face above the rising puddle, but his bound hands made it impossible. "Shovel!" the older man commanded. The first spadeful of heavy wet clay hit Gabriel in the chest. Leo bit down hard on his knuckles to keep from making a sound. The metallic taste of dirt and sweat filled his mouth. He watched paralyzed as the two men settled into a horrific blue-collar rhythm. Thwack, slop, thud. They shoveled dirt onto a living human being with the same casual annoyance of men clearing snow from a driveway. Gabriel's muffled shouts began to fade beneath the weight of the earth. He kicked violently, displacing the mud, but there were two of them and only one of him. The heavy man stepped down into the trench, stomping the dirt down over Gabriel's legs to pin him. "I ordered a melt at that diner on Route 9 earlier," the heavy man said, panting as he worked. "Cheese was cold. Fucking unacceptable." "Write a review, Tommy," the older man sneered. "Keep digging." The casualness of it made Leo's stomach turn. He had seen violence on the streets. He had been stabbed for a pair of boots. But this was industrial. This was extermination. Eventually, the frantic heaving beneath the soil stopped. The dirt lay flat, a messy brown scar against the forest floor. The two men stood over it, chests heaving, leaning on their shovels. They waited for 5 long, agonizing minutes. No movement. No sound. "All right, he's done," the older man said. They threw the shovels back into the trunk, slammed it shut, and got into the Lincoln. The headlights flicked on, blinding Leo for a fraction of a second, before the car backed up, tires spinning in the mud, and drove away into the night. The woods fell silent, save for the relentless drumming rain. Leo didn't move for 10 minutes. He sat in the hollow of the tree, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The cold had seeped into his bones, but the shivering wasn't entirely thermal. It was adrenaline, sour and corrosive in his veins. He should walk away. He should go back to his makeshift tent under the overpass. The man in the ground was a criminal. Only monsters got buried alive by other monsters. But Leo looked at the flat patch of disturbed earth. "He's dead," Leo told himself. 5 minutes under heavy wet clay. He suffocated. It's over. Then a strange, selfish thought crept into Leo's mind. The man had a gold watch on his left wrist. Leo had seen the glint of it when they dragged him. A watch like that could buy hot meals for a year. A motel room for the winter. It was a sick thought, a vulture's thought, but starvation makes scavengers of everyone. Leo crawled out of the tree. His knees popped. The mud sucked at his worn sneakers as he crossed the clearing. He knelt beside the makeshift grave. The earth was loose, unsettled, turning to sludge in the downpour. He hesitated. The smell of turned earth was suffocating. He pressed his ear toward the mud. Nothing. Just the rain. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out his only tool, a flattened, rusted piece of corrugated steel he used to pry open dumpsters. He plunged it into the mud where he estimated the man's chest would be. Just dig up the arm. Get the watch. Leave. He started scraping. The clay was incredibly heavy, resistant, and sticky. Within minutes, Leo's hands were cramping. His fingernails tore against a buried root, sharp pain flaring up his arm. He cursed, dropping the metal scrap and using his bare hands. He dug like a frantic dog, throwing handfuls of wet earth over his shoulder. His fingers brushed something smooth and cold. Fabric. The suit jacket. He shifted his position, frantic, now moving upward toward the head. The vulture instinct was entirely gone, replaced by a sudden sickening panic. He was digging up a grave. He was alone in the dark with a corpse. He hit flesh. Leo flinched backward, landing hard on his backside in a puddle. He stared. A pale forehead was exposed in the dirt. He scrambled forward again, his breathing ragged. He clawed the mud away from the face. It was a nightmare. Gabriel's face was a mask of brown sludge. Dirt was packed into his nostrils, his mouth open and crammed with wet clay. His eyes were closed. His skin was ice cold to the touch. Leo stared at the dead man. "Damn it," he whispered. He reached down to grab the wrist. But as his fingers wrapped around Gabriel's forearm, the man's chest gave a violent microscopic jerk. Leo froze. Another jerk. A spasm. It wasn't breathing. It was a neuromuscular misfire. The brain screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. "Oh, God!" Leo choked out. He didn't think. He didn't rationalize. He lunged forward and started frantically scooping the mud out of the man's mouth. He used his thumb, hooking it into Gabriel's cheek, pulling out thick clotted chunks of wet clay and bile. It was disgusting. It felt violating. But he kept digging into the airway, swiping the mud from Gabriel's nose. "Breathe!" Leo hissed, slapping the man's cold cheek. "Come on, breathe!" Nothing. Leo straddled the man's chest. The dirt was still pinning Gabriel's lower half, but his torso was exposed. Leo placed his muddy hands on the center of the ruined silk shirt and shoved down with all his meager body weight. Crack. Another rib gave way. Leo winced, but pumped his arms again and again. Suddenly, Gabriel's body convulsed. A horrifying wet sound erupted from his throat, a cross between a cough and a death rattle. Mud and dark fluid spewed from his lips, splattering across Leo's jacket. Gabriel sucked in a ragged, tearing gasp of air. His eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot wild, and utterly devoid of humanity in that first second. He was drowning in the air, his chest heaving violently against the weight of the dirt still covering his legs. Leo fell back off him, scrambling backward on his hands and feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Gabriel choked, turning his head to the side and vomiting a mixture of swamp water, mud, and blood onto the grass. He kept gagging, gasping, trying to drag his body forward. His hands were still zip-tied behind his back. He looked like a broken snake writhing in the dirt. "Hey," Leo said, his voice cracking. "Hey, stop moving. They tied your hands." Gabriel's wild eyes locked onto Leo. Even through the swelling and the dirt, the intensity in that stare pinned Leo to the ground. There was no gratitude. There was only the raw, calculated assessment of a predator assessing a new environment. "Knife," Gabriel rasped. His voice sounded like it was dragging over broken glass. "I don't have a knife," Leo stammered, pulling his knees to his chest. "Get me out!" Gabriel wheezed, his head falling back into the mud as exhaustion overtook him. Leo looked around the dark woods. The rain was washing the dirt back into the hole. If those men came back to check the grave, they would both be dead. Leo gritted his teeth. He grabbed his rusted piece of metal, crawled behind Gabriel, and began sawing furiously at the thick plastic zip ties. It took 3 agonizing minutes of sawing the metal biting into Gabriel's wrists before the plastic snapped. Gabriel's arms fell limply to his sides. He couldn't move them. His shoulders were dislocated or completely dead from the strain. "You have to get up," Leo said, grabbing the man by the lapels of his suit. He tugged, but Gabriel was pure dead weight. 200 pounds of muscle and wet wool. Leo weighed 130 on a good day. "I can't carry you. Get up." Gabriel groaned, his fingers twitching in the mud. He dug his boots into the sides of the trench, using his core to slide backward. Leo grabbed him under the armpits, slipping in the mud, straining until black spots danced in his vision. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they dragged Gabriel out of the grave. They collapsed on the wet grass, staring up at the canopy of trees, both gasping for air. "We can't stay here," Leo managed to say. "They might come back." Gabriel didn't answer. He had passed out again. Leo cursed viciously. He looked at the gold watch, then at the man's ruined face. He slipped his arms under Gabriel's heavy shoulders, locked his hands over the man's chest, and began to drag him through the mud toward the concrete ruins of the drainage system. The abandoned aqueduct tunnel smelled of stagnant water rat droppings and old spray paint. It was dry, at least shielded from the downpour by a thick arch of crumbling concrete. In the deepest recess of the tunnel, behind a pile of rusted shopping carts, was Leo's camp, a sleeping bag patched with duct tape, a stolen milk crate, and a battery-powered lantern. Leo dragged Gabriel the last 10 feet, letting the man's heavy head rest on a rolled-up pile of dirty clothes. Leo's arms were trembling so violently he could barely strike a match to light the small camp stove he used for warmth. The pale blue light of the lantern clicked on, casting long, wavering shadows against the curved concrete walls. Leo collapsed onto the milk crate, wiping his muddy face with the back of his sleeve. He looked at the creature he had dragged into his home. Gabriel looked worse in the light. His custom-tailored suit was a destroyed, muddy rag. His face was a patchwork of deep purple bruises and lacerations. But even unconscious and battered, there was a heavy, dangerous gravity to him. The broad line of his jaw, the expensive haircut matted with clay, the thick gold watch still ticking flawlessly on his wrist. He didn't belong in the dirt. He belonged behind a mahogany desk, ruining lives. "What did I just do?" Leo whispered to himself. He leaned forward and unbuttoned Gabriel's suit jacket, peeling the heavy, soaking wet fabric off his shoulders to check for bullet holes. There were none, just deep, dark bruising along his ribs, where the heavy man had kicked him. Leo took an old, relatively clean towel from his backpack and roughly wiped the remaining mud from Gabriel's face and neck. As Leo's hand brushed Gabriel's throat to check his pulse, a hand shot out in the dim light. Gabriel's fingers closed around Leo's wrist like a steel vise. Leo gasped, dropping the towel. Gabriel's eyes were open. They were dark, assessing, and completely lucid. The feral panic from the woods was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating violence. With a terrifying surge of strength for a man who had just been clinically dead, Gabriel yanked Leo forward, knocking him off the milk crate. In a split second, Gabriel rolled, pinning Leo to the cold concrete floor, his forearm pressing brutally against Leo's windpipe. Leo choked his hands instinctively, coming up to claw at Gabriel's arm. Gabriel leaned over him, breathing heavily, drops of muddy water falling from his hair onto Leo's face. "Who are you?" Gabriel rasped, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat. "Who sent you?" "Get off!" Leo choked out, kicking his legs, but Gabriel's weight was immovable. "I asked you a question," Gabriel whispered, increasing the pressure on Leo's throat. Blackness edged into Leo's vision. The smell of Gabriel copper blood, wet earth, and an underlying trace of sandalwood cologne was suffocating. Leo stopped thrashing. He forced his panic down. He looked straight up into the dark eyes of the man murdering him and spat in his face. Gabriel blinked, shocked by the defiance. The pressure on Leo's throat eased just a fraction. "I pulled you out of the dirt, you ungrateful prick," Leo rasped, coughing violently. "You were choking on your own vomit. I should have let them finish the job." Gabriel stared down at the scrawny, filthy kid beneath him. His gaze flicked around the tunnel, taking in the pathetic sleeping bag, the damp walls, the absolute isolation. The adrenaline spike that had fueled his attack began to crash. He wavered, his arm trembling against Leo's throat. Slowly, carefully, Gabriel lifted his weight off Leo. He rolled off, collapsing back against the concrete wall, with a heavy groan clutching his broken ribs. Leo scrambled backward, crawling until his back hit the opposite wall. He rubbed his raw throat, glaring at the man. "Touch me again and I'll drag you back out to the rain and leave you for the feral dogs," Leo threatened, though his voice shook. Gabriel closed his eyes, resting his head back against the stone. A bitter, painful smirk tugged at the corner of his split lip. Fair enough. Silence settled in the tunnel, broken only by the distant echo of rain falling outside. Gabriel's chest rose and fell in shallow, painful increments. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Leo, really looking at him this time. He saw the hollow cheeks, the defensive posture, the sharp intelligence in the kid's guarded eyes. "You didn't run," Gabriel stated quietly. "I had nowhere to go," Leo lied. He hugged his knees to his chest. "Why dig me up? You saw who put me there. You know what happens to people who interrupt cartel business." "I don't know anything about any cartel," Leo snapped defensively. He looked away, staring at the small flame of the camp stove. I heard you stop breathing. It bothered me." Gabriel let out a low, breathy chuckle that ended in a wince of pain. "It bothered you?" He turned his head, his dark eyes fixing onto Leo with a sudden intense heat that made Leo's stomach tighten. "What's your name, kid?" "None of your business." "You saved my life. I own that. I need a name." "I don't want anything from you. I want you gone when the sun comes up." Gabriel tilted his head, studying Leo with a slow, sweeping gaze that felt entirely too intimate for the cold, damp tunnel. "I'm Gabriel," he said softly, "and I don't leave debts unpaid, whether you want me to or not." Leo swallowed hard, unnerved by the way Gabriel was looking at him. It wasn't the look of a killer anymore. It was the look of a man who had just found something incredibly valuable buried in the trash. "Just focus on not dying on my floor," Leo muttered, tossing the dirty towel back at him. "I don't have a shovel to bury you again." The chill of the concrete floor was nothing compared to the heat radiating off Gabriel's skin. By dawn, the adrenaline had completely burned out of the man's system, leaving nothing but the brutal reality of what his body had endured. The trench water he had inhaled was teeming with bacteria. It settled in his lungs and seeped into the raw abrasions on his wrists and face. Gabriel didn't wake up when the weak gray morning light filtered through the storm drain. He just shivered, a violent bone-rattling tremor that made his teeth click together. Leo sat on his milk crate, chewing on a stale thumbnail. He had slept for maybe 20 minutes, his hand wrapped around the rusted piece of scrap metal in his pocket. He watched Gabriel's chest heave. The breaths were wet and shallow. "Leave him a voice," in Leo's head urged. "You pulled him out. Debt paid. If he dies here, you just roll him into the drainage canal and walk away." Gabriel let out a low, miserable sound. It wasn't a word. It was the noise an animal makes when it knows it's caught in a trap. He kicked his legs out, tangling them in Leo's cheap sleeping bag, his forehead slick with thick, greasy sweat. Leo cursed. He kicked the milk crate back and stood up. He grabbed an empty plastic milk jug and slipped out of the tunnel. The rain had stopped leaving the industrial park smelling of wet asphalt and ozone. Leo walked 1.5 miles to a heavily barred gas station on the edge of the district. He spent his last $5 on 2 bottles of generic rubbing alcohol, a roll of heavy-duty paper towels, and a pack of razor blades. While the clerk was distracted by a delivery driver, Leo slipped a bottle of children's liquid ibuprofen and a tube of triple antibiotic ointment into his oversized coat pocket. The theft made his heart hammer against his ribs, but he didn't run. He walked out with his head down, clutching the plastic bag. When he returned to the aqueduct, the smell of sickness was heavy in the damp air. Gabriel had rolled onto his side. His ruined suit jacket was plastered to his back with sweat. "Hey," Leo said, his voice echoing flatly against the concrete. Gabriel didn't respond. His eyes were half open, but they were glassy, tracking something that wasn't there. Leo knelt beside him. The intimacy of the situation made his skin crawl. He avoided touching people. Touch meant violence or violation on the streets. But Gabriel was a furnace. Leo grabbed the lapels of the charcoal suit and tugged. "Sit up. You have to get this off," Leo muttered. Gabriel's arm flailed weakly, swatting Leo away. "Don't," he mumbled, his voice a gravelly slur. "Tell Carson." "No, I don't know who Carson is, and I don't care," Leo said. He forced Gabriel's heavy shoulders up, fighting the dead weight, and peeled the ruined, mud-caked jacket off. The silk shirt underneath was torn and stained with brown water. Leo unbuttoned it, his fingers slipping on the slick fabric. He stripped Gabriel to the waist. The bruising was horrific. A massive purplish-black mass bloomed across his left rib cage, where the heavy man had kicked him. His wrists were a mess of lacerations from the zip ties, the edges of the cuts already angry and red. But underneath the violence, Gabriel's body was a map of old history. Pale raised scars crisscrossed his abdomen and shoulders, bullet grazes, knife wounds, the architecture of a violent life. Leo unscrewed the cap of the rubbing alcohol. "This is going to suck," he warned the unconscious man. He poured the alcohol directly over Gabriel's wrists. Gabriel roared. His back arched off the concrete, his eyes snapping wide open in pure, blinding agony. His hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of Leo's coat and jerking him forward with terrifying strength. "I know," Leo shouted, pushing his hands against Gabriel's bare, burning chest to keep him back. "I know, just hold still, it's infected." Gabriel's breathing was a harsh, ragged saw. He stared at Leo unseeing for a long moment before the glassy fever haze swallowed him again. His grip loosened. He collapsed back onto the sleeping bag, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. Leo worked quickly, his hands shaking. He cleaned the mud from the lacerations, slathered them in stolen ointment, and bound them tightly with torn strips of a relatively clean T-shirt. He forced Gabriel's mouth open and dumped half the bottle of children's ibuprofen down his throat, massaging his jaw to force him to swallow. When it was done, Leo sat back on his heels, exhausted. His knuckles were white. Gabriel, shivering, subsided slightly. His head turned toward Leo. The fever was still burning, but a sliver of lucidity cut through the haze. "Why are you still here?" Gabriel whispered. "I live here," Leo said flatly. "You should have let me rot." "Yeah, well, I have a problem with poor decision-making," Leo said, tossing the bloody paper towels into a pile. "Go to sleep. If you die, I'm keeping your watch." Gabriel's lips parted in a ghost of a smile. He closed his eyes, and the darkness of the tunnel swallowed the silence between them. It took 2 days for the fever to break. For 48 hours, the aqueduct was a purgatory of stagnant time, harsh coughing fits, and the smell of copper and sweat. Leo rationing out half a stale bagel, drinking water from the gas station tap. He didn't leave the tunnel for long. He told himself it was because Gabriel would be vulnerable to the feral dogs that roam the train tracks. He didn't want to examine the real reason he stayed rooted to the damp concrete. On the third morning, the shift in the air was palpable. Leo was sitting against the curved wall, using a pocket knife to carve meaningless shapes into the side of his boot, when he felt the weight of a stare. He looked up. Gabriel was awake. Really awake. The glassy sheen was gone from his dark eyes. The feral panic was absent. Instead, he lay on the sleeping bag perfectly still, watching Leo with an unnerving predatory stillness. The bruising on his face had settled into harsh yellows and deep purples, making the sharp angles of his jaw look even more menacing. "You're staring," Leo said, snapping the pocket knife shut with a sharp clack. Gabriel slowly pushed himself up. He winced his hand instinctively, going to his broken ribs, but he didn't make a sound. He rested his back against the cold stone, pulling his knees up slightly. He looked down at his bare chest, at the crude torn shirt bandages on his wrists, and then at the empty bottle of children's ibuprofen near his boot. "Strawberry flavor?" Gabriel rasped. His voice was thick with disuse, but the dangerous bass note was back. "Very thoughtful. It was that, or grape. Grape tastes like cough syrup," Leo muttered, refusing to look at him. Gabriel reached up and touched his own throat. He coughed a dry, painful sound. "Water." Leo grabbed the plastic jug, stood up, and tossed it to him. He didn't hand it over gently. Gabriel caught it with one hand, his reflexes sharp despite the trauma. He unscrewed the cap and drank deeply, water spilling down his chin and chest. He didn't care. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving Leo. "You live here," Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question. He was categorizing the space. The single sleeping bag, the stolen milk crate, the small pile of scavenged tin cans in the corner. Brilliant deduction. No heat, high moisture, high visibility from the southern entrance if a flashlight hits the curve. Gabriel's gaze flicked to Leo's thin frame, the oversized coat, the defensive posture. "You don't sell. You aren't using. You're just hiding." Leo's jaw tightened. "Are you done playing detective because I can point you toward the exit right now?" Gabriel set the water jug down. "What's your name?" "I told you I don't. I owe you my life." Gabriel interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, turning the air in the tunnel heavy. "Men have bled out on marble floors trying to buy what you gave me for free. I need a name." Leo swallowed. The intensity in Gabriel's eyes was paralyzing. It wasn't gratitude. It was ownership, an acknowledgement of a bond that Leo wanted absolutely no part of. "Leo." He finally said the word, tasting like a concession. Gabriel tested the name on his tongue silently. He nodded once. "Leo. I need a phone, a burner, not traced." Leo laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "Do I look like an electronics store? I don't have a phone." "Then get one." Gabriel shifted, grimacing as his ribs ground together. He reached over to the pile of his discarded, ruined clothes. He dug into the hidden interior pocket of the shredded suit jacket and pulled out a money clip. The silver clip was bent, but it held a thick wad of bills, muddy damp but usable. He peeled off $200 bills and tossed them onto the concrete between them. Buy a cheap prepaid phone. Buy yourself a hot meal. Bring me the change. Leo stared at the money. $200. He hadn't held that much cash in 3 years. His stomach gave a pathetic hollow rumble at the mention of a hot meal. He looked from the bills to Gabriel. I could just take this and never come back, Leo warned. You could. Gabriel agreed, his expression utterly unreadable. But you won't. You don't know me. I know you dug a dead man out of the mud with your bare hands, Leo, Gabriel said softly. You aren't going to leave me here. The absolute certainty in Gabriel's voice infuriated Leo. He hated the arrogance. He hated how the man commanded the filthy tunnel like it was a boardroom. But mostly he hated that Gabriel was right. Leo snatched the bills off the floor, shoving them deep into his pocket. I want you out of here by tonight. Just get the phone, Gabriel said, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the concrete. The pawn shop on 4th Street smelled of dust and desperation. Leo bought a cheap, chunky prepaid cell phone for $40. He didn't buy a hot meal. Every second he spent in the open air made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He bought 2 greasy breakfast sandwiches from a bodega, a gallon of clean water, and walked fast, taking the alleyways back toward the industrial park. The sun was high now, cutting harsh, bright angles through the rusted, skeletal remains of the old factory above the aqueduct. As Leo approached the slope leading down to his tunnel entrance, he froze. 50 yards away, near the edge of the tree line, where the dirt was still soft, stood 2 men. Leo ducked behind the rusted shell of a burned-out sedan, his breath catching in his throat. He peered through the shattered passenger window. It was them. The cinder-block man in the cheap trench coat and the leaner, older one, Briggs and Tommy. They were standing over the disturbed earth of the empty grave. In the harsh daylight, the trench was glaringly obvious. The mud was scattered, the hole gaping open like a wound. The older man was pacing, running a hand through his thinning hair, his face red with panic. He was talking rapidly, gesturing violently at the empty hole. The heavy man was staring down into the muddy water at the bottom, looking confused and terrified. They know. Panic spiked cold and sharp in Leo's chest. He backed away from the sedan, his sneakers silent on the damp weeds. If they found the grave empty, they would search the immediate area. The aqueduct was less than a quarter-mile away. Leo sprinted. He slid down the concrete embankment, tearing his jeans on a piece of rebar, and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. He found Gabriel exactly where he'd left him, though he had managed to pull his ruined, mud-stained slacks on and was attempting to wrap his ribs tighter with the torn T-shirt. "They're back," Leo gasped, dropping the plastic bag with the water and sandwiches. He was shaking. "The guys who put you in the ground. They're looking at the hole." Gabriel stopped moving. The calm, composed mask he had worn earlier vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal focus of a predator. He didn't ask questions. He didn't panic. "How far?" Gabriel asked, standing up. He swayed slightly, his face draining of color, but he planted his feet wide and forced himself steady. "Quarter mile, by the trees." Leo grabbed his sleeping bag and started frantically stuffing it into his backpack. "We have to run. If they come down here, they will come down here." Gabriel interrupted, his voice dead flat. "It's the only logical cover within a mile. They need to find me before I contact my people, or they are dead men." He held his hand out. "Phone." Leo fumbled in his pocket and practically threw the prepaid brick at him. Gabriel caught it rapidly dialing a number from memory. He held it to his ear, his dark eyes scanning the shadows of the tunnel. "Pick up, pick up," he muttered. Leo strapped the backpack over his shoulders. "We can take the north grate. It empties out near the train yard." "Carson," Gabriel said into the phone, his voice suddenly shifting, authoritative, sharp as a blade. "I'm alive. Tommy and Briggs turned on me. They tried to bury me off Route 9 near the old chemical plant. I need an extraction. Quiet and heavy." He listened for 2 seconds. 10 minutes. If I'm not at the extraction point level, the grid." He snapped the phone shut and crushed it under the heel of his boot, grinding the plastic into splinters. "North grate," Gabriel commanded, looking at Leo. "Lead the way." They moved as fast as Gabriel's shattered ribs would allow. The tunnel sloped downward, the floor, slick with old moss and trickling water. Gabriel's breathing was a harsh, agonizing sound in the enclosed space, but he never slowed his pace. He stayed right behind Leo, a heavy, looming presence in the dark. "Hey, down there!" The shout echoed from the entrance behind them, magnified by the concrete tube. Leo's heart slammed against his sternum. He looked over his shoulder. The silhouette of the heavy man Tommy was blocking the light at the tunnel entrance. A flashlight beam clicked on, cutting through the darkness, sweeping over the curved walls. "Run!" Gabriel snarled, grabbing the back of Leo's coat and shoving him forward. They scrambled over piles of debris. The flashlight beam danced wildly behind them, creeping closer. Heavy boots splashed in the puddles. "Briggs, I got movement in the pipe." Tommy's voice boomed, followed by the terrifying metallic clack-clack of a slide racking on a handgun. "He's got a gun!" Leo choked out, his legs burning as they navigated a tight turn in the aqueduct. "Keep moving," Gabriel grunted. They reached the north grate. It was a massive iron grid blocking the end of the pipe, designed to catch large debris before the water hit the river. Leo grabbed the rusty bars, throwing his weight backward to swing the hinged door open. It didn't budge. "It's stuck!" Leo panicked, kicking at the rusted padlock holding the latch shut. "It's rusted shut." Gabriel slammed into the grate beside him, gripping the bars. He yanked with brutal force, but his broken ribs gave out. He collapsed to one knee, coughing violently, spitting blood onto the concrete. The flashlight beam rounded the corner, catching them perfectly in its blinding glare. "Well, look at this!" Tommy's voice echoed thick with malicious relief. The heavy man stepped into the light, raising a black semi-automatic pistol, pointing it squarely at Gabriel's chest. "Looks like a rat dragged you out of the dirt, boss." Gabriel slowly stood up. He didn't look at the gun. He stepped entirely in front of Leo, using his own battered body as a human shield, blocking Leo from Tommy's sightline. "You always were a sloppy worker, Tommy," Gabriel said. His voice was smooth, devoid of fear, laced with an arrogant mockery that made the hairs on Leo's arms stand up. "Couldn't even dig a hole right." The flashlight beam trembled. It wasn't an intentional movement. It was the micro-tremor of a man who realized the ghost he was hunting had teeth. Tommy stood 20 feet away, the heavy frame of his 9mm pistol catching the harsh glare of the bulb. The tunnel amplified the wet, heavy sound of his breathing. Behind him, the splashing of frantic footsteps echoed off the curved concrete as the older man, Briggs, finally rounded the bend. Briggs stopped short, his chest heaving under his soaked windbreaker, his eyes wide, as he took in the sight of Gabriel standing upright. "I told you," Briggs gasped, bracing his hands on his knees, his voice cracking with panic. "I told you we should have put a round in his head." "Shut up," Tommy snapped, though his voice lacked its usual gravelly authority. He tightened his grip on the gun, aiming it dead center at Gabriel's ruined chest. "Doesn't matter. We finish it here. Dump them both in the grate. Let the river take them." Leo pressed his back so hard against the rusted iron bars of the grate he felt the cold metal bite through his jacket. His lungs refused to pull in enough oxygen. His vision tunneled the edges, fraying into black static. He was going to die in a sewer. He was going to bleed out on a bed of wet trash and rat bones because he couldn't leave a dead man in the mud. He gripped the back of Gabriel's muddy shirt, a pathetic, instinctual grab for an anchor. Gabriel didn't look back. He didn't flinch. Despite the broken ribs, the fever sweat still clinging to his hairline, and the extreme blood loss, he stood with a terrifying, relaxed posture of a man entirely comfortable with violence. "You're shaking, Tommy," Gabriel observed. The acoustics of the pipe turned his quiet voice into a razor. "You always were an amateur. You hire out for the heavy lifting because you don't have the stomach for the mess. And now you're looking at a mess." "Shut your mouth," Tommy yelled. His finger tightened on the trigger. "You missed the artery when you cut the brakes on the senator's car last year. You left fingerprints on the steering column in Chicago." Gabriel continued his tone, conversational, bored, even. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. His boots splashed softly in the shallow water. "And tonight, you buried a man alive and didn't even stay to watch the dirt settle. Laziness, Tommy. It breeds mistakes." "Shoot him!" Briggs shrieked, backing away toward the shadows. "Do it, you stupid son of a bitch, before he gets in your head." "I'm going to kill you," Tommy whispered, the gun wavering up to Gabriel's face. "You aren't going to do anything," Gabriel said, his dark eyes locking onto Tommy's with a suffocating gravitational pull. "Because you know that if you pull that trigger, Carson will peel your skin off with a paring knife while you breathe. You know what he does to traitors. You've heard the tapes." Tommy swallowed loudly. The sound echoed. A bead of sweat dripped down his thick nose. He was a brute, a man accustomed to intimidating the weak. Confronted with the absolute unblinking abyss of Gabriel's authority, the cinder block of a man was crumbling. "Don't let him talk," Briggs yelled, drawing his own weapon, a smaller, snub-nosed revolver. Leo squeezed his eyes shut. This is it. He braced for the deafening crack of the gunshot. He braced for the tearing pain of hot lead tearing through Gabriel and into him. Instead, the darkness of the tunnel was shattered by a blinding, strobing flash of pure white light from the opposite direction. A heavy, suppressed thwip, thwip, thwip cut through the damp air. It sounded like someone aggressively whipping a heavy, wet towel. Tommy's right shoulder exploded in a spray of dark crimson mist. The heavy 9mm flew from his hand, clattering uselessly onto the concrete floor. Before Tommy could even process the shock, a second suppressed round caught him in the kneecap. His leg folded backward with a sickening snap, and he collapsed into the dirty water, screaming a high, reedy sound that didn't match his massive frame. Briggs spun around, raising his revolver blindly into the blinding light behind them. 2 more suppressed shots. Briggs dropped like a stone, his windbreaker instantly soaking with blood, his body sliding down the curved wall and coming to rest face down in the stagnant water. The echoing screams of Tommy were the only sounds left. Leo slowly opened his eyes. His heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He peeked around Gabriel's broad shoulder. 4 figures materialized from the blinding glare of high-lumen tactical flashlights. They moved with terrifying synchronized silence, wearing dark, unmarked tactical gear. No police badges, no military insignias, just black armor and matte black rifles. The lead figure, a tall, lean man with a face scarred by old burn marks, lowered his rifle and stepped into the dim wash of ambient light. He looked at the screaming Tommy thrashing in the water, then kicked the discarded 9mm out of reach with a casual flick of his boot. He stopped a few feet from Gabriel, lowering his head in a brief deferential nod. "Carson," Gabriel breathed his voice, finally losing its razor-sharp edge, dipping into pure exhaustion. "Boss," Carson replied. His voice was a gravelly monotone, completely devoid of adrenaline, despite having just gunned down 2 men. He surveyed Gabriel's ruined suit, the brutal bruising on his face, and the crude bloody bandages on his wrists. "You look terrible." "You're late." Traffic on the I-95. Carson deadpanned. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled a sleek black radio from his tactical vest. "Clean-up crew to the south entrance. Bring the heavy bags." Carson's cold assessing gaze finally shifted from Gabriel to the scrawny, terrified kid pressed against the rusted iron grate. Leo shrunk back under the scrutiny. Carson's eyes were like dead glass. They analyzed Leo as a variable, a potential loose end. "Who's the stray?" Carson asked. Gabriel swayed his hand, clutching his broken ribs. The sheer force of will that had kept him standing was rapidly evaporating. "He's with me. He's a civilian, boss. We have protocols." Carson's hand drifted slowly back toward the sidearm holstered on his thigh. Leo's breath hitched. He had survived the gravediggers, only to be executed by the rescue team. He looked at Gabriel, expecting the man to step aside, to let the natural order of this violent world correct itself. Instead, Gabriel moved backward, deliberately placing himself between Carson and Leo once again. The message was unmistakable. "I said," Gabriel growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden vicious threat. "He is with me. You touch him, Carson, and I'll break your hands." Carson's hand froze hovering over his holster. He stared at his boss for a long, calculating second, measuring the sincerity of the threat. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender and stepped back. "Understood." Gabriel turned to look at Leo. The imposing, terrifying Mafia boss vanished for a split second, replaced by a broken man holding himself together with spit and spite. He held out his hand, not a command, but an offer. "Let's go, Leo. I owe you a hot meal." Leo looked at the hand. It was stained with dirt and dried blood. He looked at the bodies bleeding out in the drainage water. The world he lived in was brutal, but it was simple. Stay hidden, stay hungry, stay alive. The world Gabriel was offering was rich, warm, and built on a foundation of corpses. With shaking fingers, Leo stepped away from the cold iron bars and took Gabriel's hand. The transition from the rotting subterranean world of the aqueduct to the frictionless reality of Gabriel's empire was physically jarring. Leo sat in the back of a heavily armored black SUV. The leather seats were butter soft and smelled of expensive conditioner. The windows were tinted so deeply the outside world looked like a perpetual twilight. The air conditioning hummed, blowing dry, filtered air that stung Leo's moisture-acclimated lungs. He felt entirely out of place. He smelled of sweat mildew and wet dog. His sneakers left muddy streaks on the pristine floor mats. He sat rigidly, his knees pulled tightly together, refusing to lean back and dirty the leather. Beside him, Gabriel was being tended to by a man with a medical bag who had been waiting in the vehicle. The medic cut away the remaining shreds of Gabriel's shirt with precise clinical shears. He worked in silence, cleaning the lacerations on Gabriel's wrists with medical-grade antiseptic that made the cab smell like a hospital. Gabriel didn't make a sound as the needle pierced his skin, stitching the deepest cut on his forearm. He rested his head against the tinted glass, his eyes closed, his breathing finally regulating. Leo watched the needle bite into flesh, pull the thick black thread through, and tie off. It was mesmerizing in a morbid way. "You're staring again," Gabriel murmured, his eyes still closed. Leo flinched, looking away, quickly fixing his gaze on his own dirty fingernails. "Sorry, just never seen someone get sewn up like a pair of torn pants before." The medic paused, offering Leo a dismissive, irritated glance before returning to his work. Gabriel opened his eyes, the dark irises catching the dim overhead reading light of the SUV. "It's a necessary maintenance," Gabriel said softly. "The life I lead doesn't offer many opportunities for natural healing." "I figured," Leo muttered. "We are going to a secure location." Gabriel continued, his tone shifting into something more formal. "A safe house in the hills. There will be hot water, food, clean clothes. You can rest." "And then what?" Leo asked, his voice laced with the heavy, abrasive cynicism that had kept him alive on the streets. "I take a shower, eat a steak, and then your guy Carson drives me back to an alley with a bullet in the back of my head. Loose ends right. That's what they say in the movies." Gabriel let out a short, breathy laugh that ended in a sharp wince as the medic pressed down on his broken ribs. He waved the medic away. The man silently packed his bag and retreated to the front passenger seat, pulling the privacy partition up. The back of the SUV was sealed off. A quiet, moving vault. "If I wanted you dead, Leo, you would be floating next to Briggs right now," Gabriel said, turning his head to face the teenager. The proximity was stifling. "I don't operate on paranoia. I operate on leverage and loyalty. You possess a unique quality I don't encounter often." "What's that stupidity? Disregard for personal safety in the face of an unfair advantage," Gabriel corrected smoothly. "You saw two men bury a stranger. You had nothing to gain and your life to lose by digging me out. Yet you did. Why?" Leo swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy ticking gold watch on Gabriel's wrist, the very thing he had initially gone to steal. He could lie. He could play the hero. But sitting in the sterile, leather-bound cage, the truth felt like the only currency he had left. "I wanted your watch," Leo said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Gabriel blinked. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his battered face. "Excuse me? When they dropped you, I saw the gold watch." Leo confessed, his hands balling into fists on his lap. "I haven't eaten a full meal in 3 days. I sleep on concrete. I saw a dead man with a Rolex and I wanted it. I went to dig up your arm to steal it. But when I touched you, you moved. You choked. And I just panicked." Leo waited for the anger. He waited for the cold Mafia wrath to descend on him. He had just admitted to being a vulture, a scavenger looking to strip a corpse. Instead, Gabriel stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then slowly, the hard, severe lines of Gabriel's face softened. A genuine, rumbling laugh built in his chest, spilling out into the quiet cabin. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a deeply amused, almost relieved sound. Gabriel reached over, unclasped the heavy gold watch from his wrist, and tossed it into Leo's lap. The metal felt icy against Leo's thin jeans. He stared at it horrified. "Keep it," Gabriel said, his eyes glittering with dark amusement. "Honesty is more expensive than gold, Leo. You didn't invent a fairy tale to make yourself a saint. You needed to survive. I understand survival better than anyone." "I don't want it now," Leo said, trying to hand it back. "Put it in your pocket," Gabriel commanded the authority, returning though less sharply. "Consider it a down payment." "For what?" "For your time," Gabriel replied, leaning back against the leather. "We'll talk when you are clean." The rest of the drive was passed in a heavy, contemplative silence. The SUV wound its way out of the industrial grimness of the city, climbing into the secluded, heavily forested hills. When they finally pulled up to a massive, brutalist concrete and glass structure hidden behind high iron gates, Leo felt a new kind of dread settling in his stomach. The aqueduct was a trap made of poverty. This place was a trap made of power. Inside the house was a masterclass in aggressive minimalism. Slate floors, vast expanses of bulletproof glass overlooking the city lights below, and stark, expensive art. It smelled of ozone-fresh rain and expensive coffee. Carson and two other armed men directed Leo down a long hallway to a guest suite. They didn't speak to him. They treated him like a fragile, highly volatile package. The bathroom was larger than the entire tunnel Leo lived in. The shower had multiple shower heads and water that ran scalding hot. Leo stood under the spray for nearly an hour, watching the brown dirt, the dried blood, and the grime of his street life spiral down the chrome drain. He scrubbed his skin until it was raw and red, trying to wash away the smell of the damp earth, the memory of Gabriel's cold skin, the deafening echo of Tommy's gun. When he finally stepped out, a stack of clothes was waiting on the marble counter. Soft, thick cotton sweatpants, a cashmere sweater, and a new pair of socks. They fit perfectly. Too perfectly. He walked out into the attached bedroom. A tray of food sat on a low glass table. A thick, medium-rare steak, roasted potatoes, and a glass of water. Leo sat on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed and ate with his hands tearing into the meat like a starved animal. He didn't taste the seasoning. He just consumed the calories, his body desperately stockpiling energy. When the plate was clean, he sat back wiping his greasy hands on his new pants. The quiet of the room was oppressive. No sirens, no rats scratching in the walls, just the faint hum of the climate control. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. The heavy mahogany door swung inward. Gabriel stood in the frame. He had showered his wet hair, combed back severely. He wore a clean black shirt that hung loosely over his heavily bandaged ribs and tailored dark trousers. The bruising on his face was spectacular, turning his handsome features into a grotesque painting of blues and purples, but his posture was immaculate. He held 2 crystal glasses with an inch of amber liquid in them. "May I come in?" Gabriel asked, though he was already stepping into the room. Leo didn't answer. He just watched the man, his guard snapping back up. Gabriel set one glass on the table next to the empty dinner plate and took a slow sip from the other. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering grid of the city. "I owe you a debt," Leo Gabriel said to the glass, his voice quiet, vibrating against the window pane. "In my world, debts are a cancer. They fester. They breed resentment. They must be cleared immediately to maintain the balance." "So clear it," Leo said, his voice hard. Give me a backpack full of cash and let me walk out the front door. We never see each other again. Gabriel turned his head, looking at Leo over his shoulder. The amber liquid swirled in his glass. I could do that. I could give you $50,000. You'd walk out of here, buy a motel room, eat well for a month. But you lack the infrastructure to protect that money. Within 6 weeks, a street gang or a corrupt cop would put a knife in your ribs and take it. You'd be dead or back in that tunnel. Leo's jaw clenched. He hated that Gabriel was right. He knew the ecosystem of the streets. Wealth without power was just a target painted on your back. Then what do you want from me? Leo demanded, standing up. The plush carpet felt weird under his bare feet. You said you operate on leverage. You don't have any on me. I don't care if I live or die. Gabriel turned fully, leaning against the cold glass of the window. He studied Leo with that same predatory assessing intensity he had shown in the tunnel. I think you do care, Leo. You just haven't had anything worth living for. Gabriel set his glass down and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a sleek black key card and set it on the glass table. I don't need a scavenger, Gabriel said smoothly, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register. I have plenty of men who can pick the bones. What I need is someone who sees the gold watch, but still chooses to dig the mud out of a dying man's throat. I need loyalty that isn't bought but forged. Leo stared at the key card. What is that? A door or a wall? It depends on how you use it, Gabriel replied. It opens the gates to this compound. It gives you unrestricted access to the lower levels. My drivers, my kitchens, my people. You want to hire me? Leo scoffed, a nervous, cynical laugh escaping him. To do what I don't know how to shoot. I don't know how to smuggle drugs. I'm a homeless kid who steals cough syrup. I have gunmen. I have smugglers, Gabriel said dismissively. I lack an apprentice. I lack someone who understands the absolute bottom of the barrel. You see the world exactly as it is, Leo. Ugly, brutal, transactional. I can teach you how to navigate it from the top. Leo felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He looked at Gabriel, really looked at him. The man wasn't offering a job. He was offering a blood oath. He was offering to take a feral dog off the street and turn it into a wolf. If I say no, Leo asked quietly, you walk out that door. My driver takes you wherever you want to go. I give you the cash, and you take your chances. The debt is paid either way. Gabriel's expression was unreadable. A perfect, terrifying mask. Leo looked down at his own hands. They were clean for the first time in years. His stomach was full. The chronic vibrating anxiety of where his next meal would come from was suddenly silenced, replaced by a much heavier, darker terror. He thought of the tunnel, the smell of wet clay, the sound of the rain masking the footsteps of predators. He thought of Briggs and Tommy, the casual cruelty of men who held power without discipline. Gabriel was a monster, yes, but he was a monster with rules. Leo slowly reached out. His fingers hovered over the black key card. His hand trembled slightly, a physical manifestation of his internal war. He wasn't naive. Picking up that card meant stepping into a world of violence, blood, and moral rot. It meant trading his soul for a warm bed. But as his fingers brushed the smooth plastic, a cynical, grounded truth washed over him. He had lost his soul a long time ago, starving under an overpass. At least this way he wouldn't freeze to death in the winter. Leo picked up the key card. He slipped it into the pocket of his cashmere sweater. He looked up, meeting Gabriel's dark, unblinking stare. There was no triumphant smile on the Mafia boss's face, only a slow, solemn nod of acknowledgement. "Good," Gabriel murmured, picking up his glass. "Get some sleep, Leo. Tomorrow we start digging." The rain began to fall against the heavy glass windows, a soft rhythmic drumming that sounded exactly like dirt hitting a wooden box. Leo stood in the quiet luxury of the room, listening to the storm, entirely aware that he had just buried himself alive. Thank you for watching the complete story of Leo and Gabriel. If you enjoyed this dark, gripping Mafia tale, please make sure to like this video and share it with your friends who love intense storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming original stories. What do you think Leo's first task will be in Gabriel's empire? Did he make the right choice or just trade one trap for another? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your theories. See you next time.